Morning people, I've wanted to make this video for a while, but the world kept falling apart. Which is kind of the point. Because I'm somebody who's constantly talking about how catastrophically screwed up the UK is, the people who follow me often ask me, Femi, but what can I do to help? So I just want to focus on one thing that you can do, because there really is only one thing that matters. The aim is to make it so that every single politician knows that if they don't support changing our voting system to one where every single vote counts equally as soon as possible, the country will hate them. So here's how you can play your part. See how many people you can get to admit, on camera if possible to make it fun, but over the kitchen table is just as good, that the UK is not a democracy. And make sure that when Keir Starmer takes power, if he refuses to make us a democracy, make sure the person you're talking to knows who to blame for that. So if you're seeing this video, that's your job. If you're having those conversations with your friends and family on a regular basis, you can rest easy in the knowledge that you're doing your bit to save the UK. And that's not a difficult argument to win, because in the UK, the party that's in government never has a majority of the vote. I think it's happened like once in the last 100 years, except for when we were literally at war. And yet the party of government almost always has a majority of the seats in Parliament, the majority of the MPs. So they can pass any law they like, get rid of any law they like, change any law they like, without having to even talk to the other parties who, mathematically, the majority of people voted for. Which means the majority of votes in the UK never have any effect on UK policy. Now, if the majority of votes effectively don't count, I don't know what your criteria for democracy are, but that doesn't meet mine. Collins Dictionary defines democracy as a system where the people choose their government, while in the UK, statistically, the majority of people don't. Unlike pretty much every other country in Europe where they use more proportional systems, where the government is made up of several parties that reflects the broad range of views in that country. So no wonder slogans like "Take Back Control" worked so well with Brexit, because the UK system is designed to leave people feeling powerless. Which is why consistent polling shows that by a ratio of 2 to 1, the people of the UK would prefer a system where the MPs in Parliament match up with the percentage of the vote that their party gets. And why the Labour Party's members voted overwhelmingly for a proportional voting system. So after the next election, the only thing standing in the way of the UK having a real democracy will be Keir Starmer. If he keeps supporting a system where the majority of votes are simply thrown in the bin, then he'll be going against the democracy of his party, the democracy of the country, and the principle of democracy itself. And the same goes for any politician who doesn't support changing the voting system. So as we get closer to the election, you're going to start to see pro-democracy groups like the Movement Forward, Labour for PR, Make Votes Matter, start publishing pledges for MPs to sign saying they support PR, proportional representation. So you'll be able to see if your MP has signed it so you know what side of history they're on. Now, as we have these conversations, because Labour will be the ones in power, it's important to know how they'll fight back against us. Now fortunately, I've done the research for you by confronting Labour MPs on this. As we know, John McDonnell is already on our side with this.
We've got to make sure those people attending the Clause 5 meeting realise this is a priority to be inserted in a clear commitment within the manifesto.
And Labour MP Clive Lewis is probably our biggest PR champion. But Labour still hasn't come out in support of PR, so let's look at what they have to say for themselves.
We see the issues with first past the post, but honestly, this election is not for us about reforming our electoral system. This election is about political change so that we can actually turn around the problems of this country.
Do you have a view on how we get that the views of the members and now the majority of the public to be reflected?
You say the majority of the public. I have to say no one ever brings it up with me. But anyway.
They're trying to argue that the people of the UK have bigger things to worry about than voting reform, especially given the cost of living crisis. So here's what you say to that. The people of the UK overwhelmingly support taxing the rich more to help poor people. And in almost every single election since World War II, they voted for parties that are more likely to tax the rich more to help poor people. And yet because of our voting system, the Tories have been the party of government for 47 of the last 77 years. And they're a party that are ideologically opposed to the idea of redistributing wealth to help poor people. We all remember Rishi Sunak literally bragging about defunding deprived urban areas to help rich ones like Tunbridge Wells.
I managed to start changing the funding formulas to make sure that areas like this are getting the funding that they deserve. Because we inherited a bunch of formulas from the Labour Party that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas, then that needed to be undone. I started the work of undoing that.
As a result, the UK is one of the most financially unequal countries in Europe, and despite being one of the richest countries on the planet, the United Nations says that UK poverty is reaching illegal levels. Therefore, if all votes counted equally, then because of how people in the UK tend to vote, we would have governments that are more focused on helping people out of poverty. And the same goes for people who care about climate change, because the majority of the UK supports moving to net zero carbon emissions. And the same goes for Brexit, because the majority of the UK would vote to rejoin the EU. So saying that people care more about the cost of living crisis or climate change than they care about changing the voting system is like saying people care more about staying alive than they care about whether they can breathe oxygen. The two kind of go hand in hand, because whatever issue you care about, you'll have a much better time fighting for it if all votes count equally. Because it's all about the national conversation, and if most votes don't count, then most voters, most of the people you'll be talking to trying to convince, don't make a difference. Again, a party with a minority of the vote always gets majority control in Parliament, so most votes don't affect UK policy. Am I wrong? In the last election, for example, if you compare the percentage of the votes that each party got to the percentage of the MPs that they got, the Tories got 44% of the vote, but that gave them 56% of the seats in Parliament. Labour got 32% of the vote, but that only gave them 31% of the seats. So Tory votes were worth 30% more than Labour votes. And if you compare it to Green votes, it's 21 times more than Green votes. So if the person you're talking to cares about the climate crisis, ask them, how do you solve the climate crisis if Tory votes are worth 21 times more than Green votes? I mean, look at the consequences that this unfair voting system has had for us in the last few years. If all votes had counted equally in 2019, then the Tories would have had less than 44% of the MPs in Parliament, so we would not have gone through a pandemic led by a Boris Johnson government that told us to shake hands with COVID patients, and gave us what the parliamentary inquiry found to be one of the worst public health failures in UK history, leading to 200,000 deaths. We also wouldn't have left the EU because the majority of votes went to parties that were offering a referendum on the Brexit deal. And even Nigel Farage said,
Remain wins that referendum and wins it every single time.
And without Brexit, the average household would be £1,000 better off and food would be cheaper, and our NHS wouldn't have been severely damaged just as we were entering a pandemic. We are talking about millions of people suffering because our voting system unfairly hands power to the Tories. So any politician that tries to tell you that electoral reform, changing the voting system, wouldn't make a big difference to people is a fucking liar. The other argument you'll hear from Labour MPs, I'll just let you watch.
There needs to be a huge amount of work that's done on exactly what that change to our democracy is, because I don't want to be a Labour MP. I want to be the Labour MP for Birmingham Yardley. And there has to be the golden, absolute golden thing about our democracy that doesn't exist in other democracies in the world, and we give it away at our peril, is the link between a constituency member of Parliament and their constituents.
So I've heard this constituency link argument before, but the problem is, given that in the majority of elections, well, in pretty much every election, a party with the minority of the vote gets a majority of the seats and they can pass any law they like without having to even consult the other parties. That means that most votes literally have no effect on UK policy. So that constituency link is meaningless if the majority is.
It's not meaningless to me, mate. It's not meaningless to my constituents.
Because you won.
No, well,
because you won. But in the majority of cases, people don't see that.
So you have got to find a system where your system meets my system.
What about a regional system? For example, if the West Midlands had, say, 5-10 MPs, and you would still be representing that area, but you would at least have a proportional representation based on the percentage of the votes that your party gets. So you would have that local link.
Now, the Labour Party's leadership will fight us on this. Both Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner have said they support the current voting system. And I can only assume that's because they think the idea of them being able to control everything is more important than making sure the people of the UK are represented fairly. So they'll make arguments along the lines of, we need one party in power to get stuff done, none of this coalition nonsense. So you need to remind them that if their argument against PR is that they want one party who the majority of the UK voted against to be able to do whatever they want without having to even consult the parties that the majority voted for, then they don't want democracy. They want dictatorship. You see, even though Labour only gets into government a minority of the time under this voting system, it still kind of suits them because all they have to do in a two-party system is just not be the Tories. So if you're frustrated that Labour hasn't given you the policies that you want, that's why. They don't feel they have to. They're the opposition party. If the Tories screw up, and boy have they been screwing up, then all they have to do is sit back and wait for voters to pass them the ball. Because they know that under this voting system, most people don't feel confident enough that if they vote for one of the smaller parties, that their vote will actually count, and so they vote tactically for Labour to make sure the Tories don't get in. And many people will feel forced to do that at the next election. Without going into detail, there have been many moments in the last 7 years where the Labour leaders have gone wildly against what they know the majority of left-minded people in the UK want.
A siege is appropriate? Cutting off power, cutting off water?
Well, I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation. Obviously, everything should be done within international law.
Your members want to be inside the single market and they want to be inside the customs union, and they want a second referendum. Now, you always say that you listen to your members. Why do you not listen to them about these things?
Yes, the membership of the Labour Party overwhelmingly voted to remain. Overwhelmingly, Labour supporters voted to remain, but a third of them didn't. A third of them voted the other way. I want to win the next election.
And they only feel comfortable doing that because they believe that we don't have any other choice. It's the same reason why Tory MPs feel comfortable doing things like voting explicitly to help Owen Paterson get away with bribery. They feel untouchable because this voting system means they can rely on safe seats. Whereas if they had to fight for every vote under a proportional system, they'd have to be better or their parties would die. Now, I know that many of you won't want to vote Labour at the next election because of how crap they've been. And honestly, I'm not that fussed about that because my ideal scenario is a hung parliament where Labour doesn't get an absolute majority and therefore has to team up with the Lib Dems, the Greens, the SNP in order to form a government who will then demand that he delivers a fair voting system in exchange for that government. So as long as you actually vote, we should be okay. So make sure you register to vote, get your friends registered to vote, and get some photo ID so you can actually vote. Keep an eye on tactical voting sites like the Movement Forward so you know which candidate in your area has the best chance of keeping a Tory MP out. But let's make sure this is the last time that any of us ever has to vote tactically again. So start talking to people now. Make sure that the next government is forced to end this abusive duopoly of Labour and the Tories. Let's make sure that all future generations can leave the voting booth knowing they voted for the party that represents them the best and that their vote will actually count. Gen Z is helping to breathe fresh life into our politics, but we're going to need a real democracy if we're going to take advantage of that. I'm Femi, this has been F Politics, so politics doesn't F you. Have a great week.